This is the story of Sarah and Abraham and the great family. And if you'd like to come and join me on the floor, you may. If you're more comfortable staying where you are, you will be able to see the story on the screen as well. Many of the important stories of the people of God take place in the desert. And so I have a little piece of the desert here with me. It's not the whole desert. It's just a piece of the desert. The desert is a dangerous place. The rains don't come often in the desert, and we need water to survive. It's hard to find food in the desert. During the day, the desert can be very hot. The sun can scorch your skin. But at night, it can be quite cool. When the wind blows, the sand stings. So you often see people wearing special clothes in the desert. The wind also changes the shape of the desert. And so it's easy to lose your way. People don't go into the desert unless they must. After the great flood, the creatures went out in the four directions to fill up the earth again with life. People and animals gathered near water. There were two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. People began to live in small towns and then big cities. One of the great cities of that time was Ur, and another was Haran. Now, the people in Ur believed in many gods. There was a god of the sky, a god for every plant, for every animal, a god of the land, the sun and the moon. The world was alive with gods. But there was one family in Ur who believed that there was one God and that all of God was everywhere. Now, in that family, there was Abram and Sarai. The time came for the family to move from Ur to Haran. They didn't know if God would be in this new place, but that is what they believed. And they set out on their journey. There were many people in the family, old people and children. They brought their animals. By day, they followed the great river Euphrates, and at night, they camped along its banks. It was a long journey. They knew they were getting close when they began to meet other travelers on the way. Finally, they arrived. Now, sometimes Abram liked to walk out into the desert. And he would look out at all of the grains of sand. He would look up at all the stars in the sky. and God would come close to Abram. And Abram felt so close to God. Abram knew what God wanted him to do. God wanted Abram and Sarai to move from Haran and to continue on their journey. And that is what they did. They headed west toward Canaan. Some of their family went along. Lot, Abram's brother's son, went with them. This time there was no river to show them the way or to give them water to drink. They arrived at Shechem. They climbed a hill. And Abram prayed to God, and God came close. And so they built an altar there to mark that God was in this place and to give thanks to God for being with them on their journey. But this was not where God wanted them to stay. And they journeyed on. They arrived in Shechem, and they prayed again, and they knew that God was with them. God wasn't just here or there, but all of God was everywhere. And so they built an altar here to mark that God was in this place and to give thanks to God for being with them on their journey. But this was not where God wanted them to stay. And they journeyed on. Finally, they reached Hebron, and they pitched their tents beneath the oaks of Mamre, and they knew that this was where God wanted them to stay. Now one night, God called Abram out into the desert. Abram looked out at all of the grains of sand, and he looked up at all the stars in the sky. And God came close to Abram, and Abram felt so close to God. God told Abram that he and Sarai would have a great family, that Abram would be the father and Sarai the mother. Now, Abram thought this was impossible, because by now he and Sarai were very old, too old for children. But God said it would be so. And God told Abram to change his name to Abraham, and Sarai was to change her name to Sarah. Many years passed, and Abraham and Sarah had no children. And then one day, 3 strangers came out of the desert, and Abraham went out to greet them. And Sarah took 3 measures of flour. She was a generous woman. And she made bread. They had bread and meat, and water and milk, as was the custom of their day. And the strangers told Abraham that he and Sarah would have a child. Now, Abraham just laughed, and Sarah, who was standing outside the tent, well, she laughed too, because by now she was so old, too old for children. the strangers went on their way. And do you know what happened? Sarah and Abraham had a child, and they laughed again. In fact, they named their child Laughter, which in their language was Isaac. Now, when Isaac grew up, Sarah, old and full of years, died. And Abraham and Isaac buried her in a cave beneath the oaks of Mamre. Now, Abraham was so lonely and he missed Sarah so much, but he knew there was one more thing he needed to do before he died. He needed to find a wife for Isaac. So Abraham sent his best helper back to the land where they had lived, where they still had friends and family. One night, the helper stopped at a well outside a city, and a young woman helped him draw water from the well for himself and his animals. Her name was Rebecca, and she invited Abraham's helper to her home for a meal. Over the meal, the helper told Rebecca and her family about Sarah and Abraham and Isaac and about the great family. And Rebecca, who was as courageous as she was kind, decided she wanted to become part of the great family. And so she made her own journey past Shechem and Bethel. As she drew near, Isaac went out to greet her. Isaac and Rebekah were married, and Abraham, old and full of years, died. Isaac and Rebekah buried him in the cave next to Sarah, beneath the oaks of Mamre. Now, Isaac and Rebekah had children, and those children grew up and had children, and those children grew up and had children, and this went on for hundreds and hundreds of years, until finally, one day your grandparents were born, and they grew up and had children, and those children grew up and had children, and you became part of the great family that is as many as the stars in the sky, and as many as the grains of sand in the desert.